Everyone, and welcome to another full-length podcast of Lashed to the Mast. This is our fifth episode. I don't really have any announcements, so I think we can just jump straight into the content here. So beginning with philosophy, as we always do, we're going to review the last podcast, and then we're going to do a deeper dive into hylemorphism as well as into form and matter. Um, so if you want to see more than this just abridged version, then please check out the philosophy number 4 video, which should explain it in a little more depth. All right, so in discussing hyalomorphism, which again is the name for the union between form and matter, we considered an example of ink written on a dry erase board. And I actually have a dry erase board over there, so it's kind of, an inspiration for this idea. The ink which exists inside a pen before being put on the board, namely wet ink, takes on another form upon drying, namely dry ink. We also saw that this dry ink takes on yet another form when it is brushed off the board, namely ink particles. Now Phaser, this is a philosopher, Ed Phaser, that is commenting on this, and who I'm pulling a lot of my philosophical content from. Phaser argues that there is a determinable substratum underlying all of these different changes called matter. All right, so we're gonna slow down, take this bit by bit. I know these can seem like really large words, but if we break it down, then we should be able to understand what's going on here. So don't panic. Don't leave the episode right now because you think philosophy's way over your head. It's not. Philosophy can be for everyone. So pull yourselves together, and we're gonna see what Phaser just said. So, determinable substratum. What does that mean? Well, determinable substratum here just means that there is ink that exists in one form or another throughout all of the three phases. Remember the wet ink, the dry ink, and then the particles of ink. There's the matter underlying all of those is the same. Even though we might not necessarily call the particles of ink particles like ink, it's still the same matter that was brushed off the dry erase board. So just to say that again, determinable substratum here just means that there is that the ink exists in one form or another throughout all three of those phases: the wet ink, dry ink, and ink particles. All right. Well, what about determinable? Well, determinable means that this constant thing, this matter that undergirds all three of these phases, like we just looked at, can be modified in certain specific ways. So, um, the substratum, which again is the matter underlying each of these three phases that the ink goes through. So the substratum underlying the wet ink, the dry ink, and the ink particles is what persists in each of these three phases. Okay, what about the thing that is doing the determining? The thing doing the determining of the substratum, kind of molding this matter into something, into a real thing. The thing doing the determining of the substratum is what causes the wet ink to be wet, the dry ink to be dry, and the ink particles to be particles. The substratum underlying this form is called matter, while the thing doing the determining is called form. So you can have the substratum of like ink or whatever. Pick your favorite example, a substratum of ink, and the matter tells us we can discern that there's the same matter there, but it's this concept of form that determines the matter that allows us to tell whether it's wet or dry or in particles. So that this is almost exactly like act and potency. Um, Potency is a capacity for existence, and here this substratum is also a capacity for existence, and then you have act modifying potency and bringing that potency into being. And then here you have form, which is associated with the actual existence of the thing. I think I jumped the gun a little bit there, so yeah, we should be going over some of that in just a sec. All right, so this may seem kind of confusing, but if we think of, oh, hey, there we go. If we think of matter and form as special cases of potency and act, we can clear things up a little bit. Hey, we were great minds, think alike. Um, so, as I just said, matter is a subset of potency, while form is a subset of act. So, as Phaser puts it much more clearly than I just did, beginning quote, matter is essentially that which needs actualizing in change. Form is essentially that which results from the actualization. Um, so, the form is so in the wet ink example, like the form would be the thing making it the thing making the ink, the matter of ink exist in a in a wet state. So it's the thing that causes wet ink to exist rather than say dry ink or ink particles. And if this wet ink dries on the dry erase board, then you can say there's another form there which is determining that ink to be dry rather than wet, and so on, for the ink particles. Um, so for this reason, then, form can exist without matter, just like act can exist without potency, while matter can exist without form, just like potency can exist without act. So yeah, and in fact, form and matter are literally just subsets of act and potency. So almost everything we said concerning act and potency also applies to matter and form. So um, oh, excuse me. So that was a review of the last episode. If you want a more in-depth version of that, then please check that one out. Or yeah, if you're still confused on act and potency, then maybe check out some of the first few videos as well, because these concepts kind of build on each other. So it's good to take your time and make sure you really understand what's going on before rushing along. Like maybe this pace is too fast for you, maybe it's too slow, but I am trying to just give you guys the time that um, you need to be successful in mastering this content. So, all right. So with that, we'll start the current episode um, by examining matter and form in terms of substances. So remember what we just mentioned. Matter can't exist without form, um, which is why it is possible for things to exist that are pure forms or a mixture of form and matter, but not pure matter. So this is exactly like the act and potency. Remember, pure act can exist. You can have an act and potency exist at the same time, or you can have nothing not being, which is really just nothingness. Here, it's you can have pure form. You can also have matter mixed with form, and then matter by itself just doesn't exist. Um, if it's isolated from any form whatsoever. Uh, so so this matter that if in theory, if we could um, take all form away from matter and just consider matter on its own, this is what is called prime matter. And then in turn, matter mixed with some existing form is called secondary matter. Um, so that would be like pretty much everything we see in the physical world today. Um, okay, so to go along with these two types of matter and form, um, to go on with these two types of matter, prime matter and secondary matter, there are two types of forms, substantial form and accidental form. All right, let's start with the substantial form. What is a substantial form? A substantial form is that which causes something to exist, i.e., separates a thing from nothingness. So, as Phaser puts it, Substances in general just are the sorts of things which exist in themselves rather than inhering in anything else, and which are the subjects of the attributes which do of their nature inhere in something else. So is really a fancy kind of fancy way to put it, but um, basically what Phaser is saying here is that um, a substantial form is a form that exists without reference to any other form. Like it's um, or even matter. I think no, not matter, but when considered in in and of itself, substantial form is that which determines what it is, what a thing is. Like it determines what a thing is, um, and the way in which it exists. So like matter can't exist without a substantial form, but a substantial form can exist with matter. But in the but sorry, I'm kind of rambling on here, but just to re-emphasize this, so matter can't exist without substantial form. Um, Substantial form can exist without matter, or it can exist with some sort of matter um, that it can modify. Okay, so in terms of accidental forms, then these are forms which do not exist in themselves, but modify some already existing substantial form, such as the hair or skin color of humans. So if you think about the substance of humans, like that would be humanity, like whatever that means on a metaphysical level. But you know, being human doesn't like there's many different iterations of that substance. Humanness, humanity, no, sorry, humanness. Um, and so things like hair color and skin color are not like are not part of the substantial form, because they're really incidental to the what a human is. Like there are people who have dark skin and there are people who have light skin, and that there's still the same substance being manifested in each of the two. Um, if you take like uh, a dog, like a golden retriever with like someone with blonde hair, like yeah, they have the same hair color, but obviously not the same substance. So that's what this idea of accidental form is trying to get at, is that hair color, skin color, or not color in general, um, and yeah, just all of these different things are accidental forms modifying the substantial form, and they don't exist in and of themselves. So if the substantial form were to go out of existence, for example, then all the accidental forms would kind of collapse with it. um, all right, let's see. All right, there's another quote here from Ed Phaser, so I'm just going to read this. Um, a form which makes of what would otherwise be utterly indeterminate prime matter some determinate concrete thing of a certain kind is a substantial form. A form which merely modifies some secondary matter is an accidental form. A corporeal substance is, to state things more precisely, a composite of prime matter and substantial form. Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, that's pretty epic. So remember the matter that we referred to. Substantial form can be said to modify prime matter, which we saw doesn't actually exist, but can be thought of in theory. So substantial form modifies prime matter, and accidental form modifies secondary matter, which, as we saw above, was um, matter attached with some sort of um, a matter attached to something else rather than you know yeah, matter without a form, basically. No matter with a form rather than prime matter which doesn't have a form. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit today, but hopefully this will get clear. um Now, a specifically Thomistic interpretation of what's going on emphasizes something else that is known as the unicity of being. This is the idea that a substance can have only one substantial form at a time. There are two ways of seeing this. First of all, if you take three forms, only one of those forms can be a substantial form, since two substantial forms would relate to one another as accidental forms do, i.e., the same thing can't have two substances, since only accidental forms can modify substantial forms and not other substantial forms. Remember, substantial forms modify prime matter, not secondary matter, which in turn modifies the substance. Ooh, sorry, substantial or substance. Sorry. All right. Um, yeah, thank you guys for bearing with me on this. This has been a little bit of a choppy episode, but okay. So the second way of seeing this is to look at the mechanism of matter and form. Prime matter exists only potentially, and if actualized by some substantial form, becomes secondary matter, that is, matter mixed with potency. Secondary matter, however, is already in some way actual, meaning that since substantial form only acts upon prime matter, it can't act upon secondary matter, just what I just said. The matter that was actualized by the substantial form can only be modified further by accidental form, since there is no prime matter anymore to act upon. Um, yeah, so that's exactly what I was saying about how, why there can, well, I guess the Thomistic interpretation why there can only be one substantial form. Now, I learned about form and matter like a few years ago, and I was very confused about what some of those meant until like very recently, actually, when I started when I picked up and started reading Bejer's Aristotle's Revenge. And he has this really illuminating quote which kind of cleared it up for me. So I would like to uh, like introduce that and just see if it helps you guys as it helped me, because yeah, this stuff is, you got to look at this stuff from a bunch of different angles before you can really grasp what's going on. All right, so the quote is, beginning quote, "The basic idea is that it seems to be essential to a thing's having a substantial form that it has properties and causal powers that are irreducible to those of its parts. Hence, water has properties and causal powers that hydrogen and oxygen do not have. Remember, water is made up of H2O, so 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. When water is synthesized out of hydrogen and oxygen, what happens is that the prime matter underlying the hydrogen and oxygen loses the substantial forms of hydrogen and oxygen and takes on a new substantial form, namely that of water. But the lesson we should draw from these considerations, according to the Thomist, is that hydrogen and oxygen do not exist actually in water, but only virtually. Notice that the claim is not that they don't exist in water at all. It is rather that they don't exist in water in the way that they exist when they exist on their own. Now, this too might sound odd. Consider that if hydrogen and oxygen were actually present in the water, then they should possess their characteristic properties and powers. That means that we should be able to burn the hydrogen and to boil the oxygen at negative 183 Celsius, but we cannot do either. Hence, the substantial forms of hydrogen and oxygen cannot be present, in which case the substances hydrogen and oxygen cannot be present. So that is just kind of, that's mind blowing. When two substantial forms like that come together, they lose both of their substantial forms and take on a new substantial form, which is different from the both of them. And that's pretty amazing. That's pretty cool. So we can now say that a true substance, when it is in its normal and mature state, is one whose tendencies are irreducible to its parts, and that this is the definition of hylemorphism. So irreducible to its parts, that just means that you can't split water into hydrogen and oxygen because those substances do not exist in the same way as they do on their own. So once you get down to water, like there's no way to further divide water. So going down to the um, they're trying to reduce that further is then impossible. So water would be the water would be an example of hylemorphism here, which is the union of form and matter. All right, we now know the metaphysical backing for hylemorphism, and hopefully the water example clears up just about everything, but there is one more part of the definition to be considered, and that is the phrase, what is in its normal and mature state. So this just means that there are attributes which flow from being a true substance. For example, having 4 legs flows from the substance of dogginess. That is, dogginess begets the property of four-leggedness. What about maned or 3-legged dogs though? Are they not dogs because they don't have 4 legs? No, these would still be considered to have the substance of dogginess, but it would be dogginess in a defective state. So thus to determine which properties flow from which substances, we need to consider the paradigm case, and that's what the phrase, when it is in its normal and mature state means. So, in conclusion, then, we saw from the last podcast how form and matter are special cases of act and potency, respectively, meant to better explain the material world. We learned about the distinction between prime matter, which is matter without form, and accidental matter, which is matter mixed with form, or secondary matter, I think it's called, as well as the distinction between substantial form, which exists in itself and actualizes prime matter, and accidental form, which adheres on the substantial form and actualizes secondary matter. Yeah, that's the most precise way of putting it. But yeah, I hope that was explained sufficiently enough in the before this. All right, so moving on with the conclusion then, we saw further how these definitions led us to a proper understanding of hylemorphism, which is substantial form acting upon prime matter. The substance created under this view is irreducible to further parts, as we saw with the example of hydrogen and oxygen in water. Finally, we learned about the specifically Thomistic doctrine of Unicity of Being, which argues that there can be only one substantial form for any given thing, and about how certain properties flow from different substances. All right, so this was kind of a lot. We covered form and matter in the past podcast, and this is kind of like the follow-up to it. I think that's pretty much all Phaser has to say on it. I don't remember which section is going to be coming next, but I know we're going to be moving on to something besides matter and form. So hopefully these 2 videos should give you a pretty good idea of what those are and what hylemorphism is. But yeah, if they don't, then yeah, sorry, just take your time over it, or and if it still doesn't work there, then just feel free to comment, and I can go a little slower for next time. All right, well, with that, let's turn over to the politics portion of the podcast. In this portion, we will be reviewing Plato's Book 4, examined last week, before moving on to Book 5. All right, so beginning of Book 4 starts with Adeimantus interrupting Plato's narration of the good state. Sorry, guys, I got to stop here. I really need to drink some water. H2O. Okay, good stuff. All right, let me go to the start of that paragraph. All right. The beginning of Book 4 starts with Adeimantus interrupting Plato's narration of the good state, arguing that the provisions for the guardian class wouldn't make them happy. If you'll remember, Plato's response was that the end being aimed at was not merely the good of any individual, but rather the good of the whole. In this way, guardians give up money, property, and fame to better enable them to guard the city. Once again, Plato emphasizes the need for musical and gymnastic training in forming guardians. From this conversation, things start to escalate rather quickly, though. Plato argues that there are 4 virtues in the state: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, and argues that in defining the first 3, justice will be that part which is left over after having considered the other 3 virtues. So he begins to by considering the other 3 virtues to see if he can find out what justice is. Starting with wisdom, he argues that it is that by which a city is well counseled. With courage, courage is the correct way to fear. That is, fear the things that ought to be feared, and uh, and courage in the face of things that ought not to be feared. Um, while moderation is agreement over who should rule. All right, so what does this leave out? What part does this leave for justice? Well, justice is just Plato argues that the thing left over is um, the doing of what is properly one's own. So justice is the doing of what is properly one's own. Remember the two controlling principles of the Republic. The first is that studying justice in the origin of a city should lead us to justice in the state, while a knowledge of justice in the state should lead us to a knowledge of justice in the individual. So, having discovered the first two, it is not surprising at all that Plato turns to justice in the individual now, after having defined justice in the state. Here he sets up his famous theory of the tripartite soul, arguing that just as there are three parts to the city, so there are three in the individual: a reasoning part, a spirited part, and a desiring part. The reasoning part is naturally associated with wisdom, the spirited to courage, and the desiring to moderation. Here, as with the city, then, justice in the individual means the doing of each part what is properly its own, exactly like the justice in the city. The rational to rule, the spirited to assist, and the desiring part to be led. This is why musical and gymnastic training are so important in Plato's view as well, since both of them discipline the desiring part to be in accord with the rational and spirited part. And remember that really long conversation or really long um, yeah, remember how long Plato went talking about musical and gymnastic training in book three, where he just goes on and on and on about like accepted forms of music and then correct ways to exercise and just all of these different things. And the reason for that is to is so that the rational and spirited part can master the desiring part and lead them to uh, where where they're supposed to go. Okay, so that was the recap. We haven't even got into book 5 yet. So that was the recap. All right, now we arrive at book 5. So book 5 starts once again with Adeimantus interrupting Socrates, but this time over the holding of men, women, and children in common in the guardian class, rather than uh, the argument that the guardians are not being set up to, rather than the argument that the guardians won't be happy under the system. So, in arguing for this view, Socrates takes the example of female dogs hunting with male dogs as an example of the equality that should exist between males and females. Beginning quote. Music and gymnastic exercise were given to the men. Therefore, this pair of arts needs to be made available to the woman too, as well as the things connected with war, and they need to be applied in the same manner. In justifying this claim, Socrates argues that men and women have different natures, but only with respect to childbearing and not with respect to anything else. In describing the current state of things, Glaucon, the person who kind of Socrates' Yeasayer, the person that Socrates is conversing with, Glaucon also argues that women are being repressed unfairly, a view that Socrates agrees with. Beginning quote, "You're telling the truth, that the one kind is dominated by the other by far in everything, as one might put it. But many women are certainly better than many men at many things, though on the whole, it's the way you say." End quote. So, turning to the family now, Socrates answers the original question that Adeimantus put forward by arguing that all wives should be held in common with all men, as well as children. He argues, uh, beginning quote, "It follows from the things that have been agreed to that as often as possible the best men ought to have sex with the best woman, and the worst on the contrary with the worst, and the offspring of the former ought to be reared, but not those of the latter, if the flock is going to be of top quality to the highest degree possible. And all these things ought to happen without the notice of anyone except the rulers themselves, if the guardian's herd is also going to be as free as possible from internal conflict." Okay, so that was a bit of a doozy argument there. Um, so I think we saw in book four how Socrates proposed using the justice system and the medical system to for the purpose of breeding, basically breeding the best form of men possible, and also for population control. So what he's saying here in terms of like the best man having sex with the best woman, that goes back to the breeding point that he made earlier about how the best way to get that the best should sleep with the best so that the children turn out to be the best. And yeah, I think there may be a quote coming. I might be jumping the gun a little bit again, but there might be a quote coming that says that, uh, dang it. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Um, Let me think. Um, yeah. Yeah, I'm not remembering it. Sorry about that. Yeah, I just kind of had a mental block there. But yeah, we should be. There we go. Okay, so that's what it was. So the children of the best parents ought to be reared, while the children of the worst parents, or any children who are defective, ought to be put in a place not to be spoken of. So, um, yes, so Socrates argues that those born in one generation are not to have sex with those of another generation. So again, remember that I'm only presenting what Plato is saying here, not an actual critique of it. So the critique will come after we're done with book 10 and the entire thing, and then we can really get into it. But this is just for stating the other side's best case. So just saying what they would say and trying to make their arguments as strong as possible. So we're not knocking down straw men. All right. So turning now to the state, Socrates argues that just as when a finger is hurt and is felt by the entire body, so a city will be affected by the least bit of good or bad that happens to its members. Thus, in this way, people will claim the pleasures and pain of everyone else as their own. Beginning quote. Therefore, when any one person is doing well or badly, people will sound out in harmony the word we were just speaking, that what's mine is going well or what's mine is going badly. Socrates now circles back to the family to examine the upbringing of children. He argues that besides the fact that they should all be held in common, children should witness the craft to which they will later practice, namely warfare for the guardians. Thus, children should go to war as well as women and men to observe, being saddled on horses so as to escape if need be. For men who have the highest distinction, Glaucon, remember that's the guy that Socrates is conversing with, Glaucon argues that they should be allowed to kiss anyone they like, male or female. A further law is added that no guardians should ravage land or burn houses. Okay, so before Socrates carries on, Glaucon asks Socrates whether any of this is possible. Socrates responds that he was only examining it from the point of view of what justice is, rather than a view towards the possibility of bringing the city into being. As a concession to Glaucon's request, though, Socrates argues that there are some changes that could be made to existing governments right away, which would set the wheels in motion towards the ideal city. The first of these changes is Plato's famous exposition on philosopher kings. Socrates argues that, beginning quote, unless philosophers rule as kings in their cities, or those now called kings and supreme rulers genuinely and adequately engage in philosophy, and this combination of political power and philosophy joins together in the same position, this polity that we've now gone over in speech will never before that sprout as far as it can and see the light of sun. To back up this claim, Socrates proposes a deeper dive into what philosophy refers to and how it can be joined to a ruler effectively. So basically, what he's saying here is that um, the proper king should be one who is a lover of knowledge and one who's not merely like the most powerful or the most popular or anything like that. You need a mixture of someone who loves the truth and someone who is able to administrate government. So, back at this plane, Socrates begins by arguing that since things are desired in whole and not in part, philosophers desire the whole of wisdom rather than a part of it. As to what wisdom is, Socrates argues that it's the love of the sight of truth. When questioned further on this point, Plato introduces his theory of forms, and we're not going to get into that here because I believe it's explained more fully in the next book. But this is this is reliant on Plato. This is an example of Plato's theory of the forms. Okay, so Plato is arguing that there is some sort of form for everything that exists that is unified with itself. So there is a unified form for goodness and one for evil, and one for like almost everything basically, even though good and evil manifest themselves in vastly different ways, i.e. the good manifests itself in people in different ways and is almost always mixed with evil, excepting like the greatest saints possibly, and Mary. But nevertheless, the forms themselves are pure and really existing things under Plato's theory. So, from this point, Socrates argues that those who love wisdom accept this reality, while those with opinions accept only the seeming of reality, in taking goodness and evil to be many rather than one. So, beginning quote. Then, as for those who gaze upon many beautiful things but don't see the beautiful itself, and aren't even capable of following someone else who leads them to it, and upon many just things but not the just itself, and all the things like that, will claim that they accept the seeming of everything but discern nothing of what they have opinions about. So, what he's saying here is that basically um, beauty manifests itself in different objects or different things, and you and that those commonalities between those beautiful things can be said to make up or all participate in the form of beauty, which is just this sort of like existent thing that is making all of these artifacts or people or whatever good in some way, and same thing with evil. So developing this idea of opinion further, and so the philosopher is the one who sees that truth, that the beautiful is one, that the evil is one, that the good is one, and the lovers of opinion are those who accept only the seeming, only the part of beauty that is there in front of them, and beauty, but they only accepting the beauty that's in front of them, but not linking it to any beauty that they see anywhere else. So they just there's no they only go on seeming. There's no desire to try to merge everything together and figure out what the relationship between beautiful things is. So, developing this idea of opinion further, Socrates argues that since accepting the seeming is a different capacity than knowledge of reality, opinion and knowledge must be two different capacities in the soul, with opinion in between ignorance and knowledge. Beginning quote. Well, weren't we claiming that in the earlier discussion that if anything would come to light as a sort of thing that is and is not at the same time, such a thing would lie between what is purely and simply and what in every way is not, and that neither knowledge nor ignorance would be directed at it, but instead something that came to light as between ignorance and knowledge. Therefore, this in-between capacity is called opinion, and is distinct from the capacity for knowledge, the knowledge of which alone can be termed a love of wisdom. Beginning quote. Therefore, those who devote themselves to each thing itself that is, ought to be called philosophers and not lovers of opinion. Okay, so in conclusion then, Socrates argues that among the guardian class, men, women, and children should all be held in common, and that the fittest men should make love to women so as to breed the best possible children. All those children that are defective, however, should be put in a place never to be spoken of. Socrates argues further that women and men should do the same things as each other, since the only difference between them is their child-rearing capability. When asked if any of this is possible by Glaucon, Socrates argues that it might take a while and argues that the only step in this direction is to have a philosopher king so that philosophical insight can be merged with political power. When pressed on the philosophical aspect of it, Socrates argues that there are unique and really existent forms of goodness and evil that manifest themselves as many in this world, but are really manifest themselves as many in this world, but are really reflections of these existent forms. So that's what I was kind of talking about with beautiful things participating in the form of beauty. To develop this further, Socrates argues that between ignorance and knowledge is a middle capacity opinion which grasps the seeming of things but not their true reality. Knowledge, on the other hand, is that which goes beyond the seeming and grasps the true reality of things. Thus, the love of the knowledge of the true reality of things is called wisdom. Oof, okay, well, that about does it for the politics side of things. Hopefully, you guys are able to follow that. Book 5 is really quite a doozy. There's just a lot of content there. Same with book 4. And I think book 6, we're going to be looking at Plato's theory of the forms. Not sure if it's quite as long as book 5, but I'm thinking we'll probably stick with one book per episode because they're definitely starting to get a little longer. All right, well, with that, let's turn it over to the economics section. All right, I'm going to need to take my customary drink of water here. Okay, give me a second, sorry. All right, so economics. This is going to be a bit of a shorter episode today, but it should be. I'm really excited about it because we're going to introduce an author that is pretty epic. All right, so without further ado, I guess let's jump in. So, yeah, as I was saying, I'm really excited for this one because um, after we review the last podcast, remember that was on Aristotle's economics, or critique of Aristotle's economics. We're going to be introducing someone named Louis de Bonald, and this book of like his collected writings is called "The True and Only Wealth of Nations: Essays on Family, Economy, and Society." So yeah, Equus, my friend from university, he recommended this book, and so that is why I know about it. And yeah, I'm really excited to present this to you guys because De Bonald is pretty epic. So going back to Aristotle for a second, though, well, more than a second. If you'll remember, we spent a lot of time in the past episode critiquing Aristotle's economics and concluded that there were four main takeaways from this book that should inform how a Catholic society should run. The first of these takeaways was the lack of context in economics due to the removal of philosophical justification. In other words, the formulae that modern economics uses is no good without any philosophical idea as to what should be measured and what ought to be done. So, in other words, garbage in, garbage out. Formulae do not formulae by their nature assume some sort of thing being input and some sort of thing being output, but they don't have any control over what those things are. So without control of that, economics is just going to pin itself to uh, radical radical materialism basically, and say that humans are greedy people, only interested in the accumulation of wealth. So if you input that into your statistics, well, yeah, it's going to, you're going to get something that is going to be the same as your input, and yeah, you're just going to be treading on ethics toes there. So yeah, garbage in, garbage out. The second of these takeaways is that it is not the self-interest of the individual abstracted from all relationships which ought to underlie economic study of human behavior, but rather the interests of the family considered both in relationship to each other and to the household. Thus, proper economics is neither individualist nor collectivist, but familialist. That's a word I made up. Since every individual by nature is related to at least his parents, and since the family relates to the entirety of society as a discrete part of it. The third of these takeaways is that economics is a part of ethics, which deals with the management of the household as well as a part of politics, which itself is a part of ethics, which deals with the administration of government. In other words, all theories about the way people ought to act fall under philosophy's jurisdiction and not that of economics. Finally, just as economics is a part of ethics, so is econometrics a part of economics that corresponds to the aspect of economics that is quantifiable. So, in this fourth takeaway, we come full circle back to the first takeaway that argued that context was necessary for the interpretation of statistics. In sum, then, ethics informs the construction of the family, i.e., how each individual ought to behave in the family, and that in turn informs economics, which in turn informs econometrics, or the statistics related to economics. All right, I'm going to take another swig here because I'm absolutely parched. Oof. Not sure if you can hear the background, but my family is part of the choir and preparing to sing something, so that should be them in the other room. Okay, so after we've just gone through Aristotle's economics, now we're gonna do an intro on Louis de Bonald, just introducing who he was and why we're looking at him next, rather than anyone else. So, who was Louis de Bonald? So Louis de Bonald was a Catholic counter-revolutionary who wrote strongly against the evils of detaching God from the state. He was born in 1754, the only son of a landowning family from south-central France. His father died when he was 4, and at 11 he was sent to an Oratorian school in Paris. In this school he was trained rigorously in the Augustinian tradition. After joining the army, he came back, married, and had 7 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. He left France to go to Germany in 1791, just as the French Revolution was starting, and was there in Germany until 1802 when he was allowed to come back. In 1814, after the restoration of the monarchy in France, de Bonald was able to speak more freely, and in 1815 actually became part of the government in the Chamber of Deputies. Along with Burke and Lemaistre, I think that's how Lemaistre, something like that. I'm not French, guys, sorry. De Bonald is recognized as one of the preeminent counter-revolutionaries. We will get into his ideas here at some length, but just to give you an overview of the significance of his philosophy, here are 2 quotes from the introduction to the work. Beginning quote, Bonald was a moralist of the old school, with a moral vision shaped by Tacitus's condemnations of Roman decadence, and he was convinced that the prescriptions of Turgot and Smith, Adam Smith, threatened nothing less than to change the very character of European man. The generous, idealistic, and chivalrous ideal of Christian civilization was, he feared, being replaced by a shrunken, narrow, and selfish vision of man. And another quote, so end quote and beginning quote, with regard to society, group, individual, and state, Bonald's philosophy is the antithesis of the Enlightenment. Yeah, so we're not going to be going over any of his actual books today, or any of the actual chapters. And again, that's my bad for getting this episode out so late. But yeah, in terms of like why we're looking at de Bonald instead of another philosopher. First of all, huge thank you to Equus. He's the one who got me the book, and that's a major reason why we're doing it. But yeah, like economics as a discipline, it didn't really exist exactly until like Adam Smith. So or at least in its present form. So to be able to critique that, you would have had to be born after the after Adam Smith in order to refute his ideas of political economy. So so instead of like, whereas Aristotle was starting from scratch in economics and just sort of like giving a pretty reasonable overview of how society should go, de Bonald here is having to deal with, people like who are diametrically opposed to what he's about, and his answers necessarily reflect like the uh, the struggle, the ideas of the time, and what whether those sort of like the culture war, would the revolutionaries win, or like, would conservatism win? Those ideas were the battleground that he was fighting in. So he's a little bit more in place. He's in a bit of a better spot to um, see the evils of economics, sorry, than pretty much any other author. I mean, Lemaitre is up there, Burke, um, but I'm not sure Burke went into. Yeah, I don't know that Burke had like really a social theory, and he wasn't Catholic. So Lemaitre was Catholic, de Bonald was Catholic. He was a very staunch Catholic. His One of his sons actually went on to become the Cardinal of Milan for 30 years. And yeah, he just modeled life. Like, he lived 48 years with his wife. Um, he, did public service. Yeah, and he is one of the most important voices against the decadence and rational, self-interested model that Adam Smith sort of created, and he goes for the throat on that one. Um, so that's why we're going with de Bonald. If we could have gone with like Aquinas, or I'm not sure if Augustine has anything on it, but de Bonald is sort of in the trenches, has a better view, and he knows, you know, the ideas that he's talking about are relevant to society, whereas like Saint Thomas wouldn't be able to. I mean, he could refute them. He probably has refuted them, honestly, but he wouldn't. He wouldn't know that they exist. Like, he was born, or he lived 600 years before that, and wouldn't really be able to comment on the specific and most important issues on in French politics at the time. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Like, I don't want to make it seem like uh, I don't want to demean St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm just saying, like, you know, it's easier to comment on something that has already happened rather than something that is going to happen in 600 years. Like, kind of a given there. So we'll probably circle back to Aquinas, and I'll search for other works as well. But Dev on all this is gonna be a pretty epic few episodes here as we get into him. So, all right, well, I think that about wraps it up for the economics session. A bit of a shorter one today. Thank you all for tuning in, and God bless.